Richard Eidlin here from Business for America. We're really happy that you can join us on this Wednesday for a discussion about what transpired in last week's election in terms of ballot initiatives, particularly pertaining to democracy and political reform. So we have with us today several guests, David Mermin from Lake Research Partners and Ellen Moorehouse from Represent Us, as well as the executive director and founder of Business for America, Sarah Bonk. So I want to first turn it over to David, who's going to give us sort of the big picture. So David, let me turn it over to you.
Great, and sounds like you can hear me now. So this is David Mermin at Lake Research Partners, talking to you from Berkeley, California. This is our California office, but we are a national research firm. As many of you know, we do research for progressive candidates and organizations, including many over the years that have worked for democracy, voting rights, and reform. I'm going to talk about some of those issues. I'm going to put my slides up here in 1 second. So, and all of these issues have really, come to a head in this election, and you will see. Ellen will talk about some of the exciting things that have happened at the ballot box and in terms of organizational work this year. I'm going to start with some research and include some work that we've done here at LRP, but also some findings. To their credit, Pew Research Center has been paying some attention to these issues this year, just released a major study in October of the voter attitudes toward democracy and participation and issues in our elections. And I think we've arrived at a moment where we're really bearing down on these and noticing that their importance to sort of the future of our democracy. And this range of issues is, potentially quite complicated. One of the challenges, I think, for advocates, and you'll hear this as we go through them, is, when you're talking about actually making changes, whether it's in our campaign finance system, whether it's in our voting system, our election rules, lobbying reform, election security, the actual changes that are needed, the actual improvements and problems have a lot of complexity to them. The solutions are, the problems are sometimes complicated, the solutions are sometimes complicated. And in the past, that has been one of the reasons it's been difficult to sort of engage voters. They haven't always paid as close attention to these kinds of democracy issues and reform issues as they have to sort of broader pocketbook issues. But of course, fundamentally, these issues are extremely important, and they do boil down to some very basic principles and values that are critical in any democracy. And it's, can people participate? Can they vote? Will their votes be counted fairly and accurately? And then more broadly than that, do they have a voice? Does it matter how they vote? Are their votes do their votes reflect what it is they have to say, and does it result in actual change? And all of these systems in terms of elections, voting, and voting rights are critical in terms of making sure those things happen. So I'm going to start first on election security, because this is, obviously a matter of greatly increased concern, particularly since some of the developments in the 2016 election, the increase in potential foreign interference in our elections, and the recognition that we have many technical vulnerabilities in terms of the vulnerabilities of our election systems to hacking and security and other issues. So we'll start again with kind of where the public is and where public attitudes are. This is from Pew, the most recent study that I mentioned, released last month, showing that there is a real lack of confidence across the country in whether our election systems are secure. And in particular, people are focused, of course, on hacking and other technological threats, because there has been demonstrated vulnerabilities in that area, and people are more greatly recognizing that. The data here show that when you ask people in the country, are you confident that election systems are secure from hacking and other technological threats? 45% are at least somewhat confident, but 55%, a majority of Americans, are not at all confident that our election systems are secure. People are somewhat more confident about systems in their own state, which reflects just a general home state bias, perhaps, although of course in reality, it is the state and local systems that are in some ways the most vulnerable and that is where we manage and govern our elections. And then, of course, there's been a great deal of attention to the possibility that foreign governments will attempt to influence our elections or already have attempted to influence our elections. And in fact, looking forward to this election, just a month ago, 2/3 of Americans, 67%, said that they were concerned and thought it was likely that Russia or other foreign governments will attempt to influence the US congressional elections. So that level of awareness and concern is new and a lot more focused than it was. And that creates obviously the opportunity and the context for possible change in terms of improving election security. And we have done what is primarily some qualitative research for an organization called Verified Voting, which works to improve election security around the country. And I would just note in terms of some of the key findings here, and these again are qualitative findings about how it is to communicate, and they have been communicating about these issues using this research. And in fact, as we try to address this, we want to be using these kinds of talking points as well, talking about the vulnerability of our elections, that so much can go wrong with them. And of course, elections in a democracy require 100% correct outcomes and true ballot secrecy. That's the fundamental principle on which our elections are based. That states have had their voter registration databases hacked. Any state that doesn't take essential steps to secure its elections could be next. So there have been many examples of security breaches and hacking in the commercial world as well as in government agencies. And that just shows that our election systems are vulnerable. They have to be better protected. And most critically, and this is the part that is, again, sort of people are growing in their awareness, but not necessarily coming into this aware of this, that ballots that are only recorded in electronic form really cannot be made secure, that they make inviting targets for attackers that could seek to undermine our elections. And the elections, fundamentally, if you look at the factual record on the ground, that 47 states remain at risk. They either lack paper backups, robust ballot audits, or both, and that there is a solution. It's always important to give people a reason, something that we can change to make, to improve things. And we have found when we offer the solution, people are quite responsive. The idea that we need voter-marked paper ballots with optical scanning to quickly count the votes, but also preserve the ability to check that they can be counted. And of course, as the vote counts continue in many states right now, this question of security remains critical in terms of making sure that we have confidence in that our votes are counted and in the outcomes of these elections. So there's lots and lots to do in terms of actual policy to make this happen. Another critical area where we've done recent research is on access to the ballot. We saw, massive turnout in this election, but that partly as a result of that massive turnout, a lot of sort of failure points and problems with our election systems. And of course, that reflects, creates a challenge in terms of whether our democracy is functioning properly. One critical thing that's been pointed out, of course, by many progressives is that voter suppression has been more overtly practiced by certain elected officials around the country, and it potentially played a role in some of these 2018 election outcomes. Most visibly right now, of course, in the state of Georgia, where the Secretary of State overseeing the election was also a candidate on the ballot for governor. They're still counting votes. There's a lot of dispute, a lot of, courts are ruling right now on to what degree the state must count all of the votes that voters attempted to cast. There are also many questions about the purges of the voter rolls that were carried out by Brian Kemp and his refusal to process 53,000 new voter registrations, putting those voters on hold. Most of those African-American voters using this error-prone exact match system. There were problems in North Carolina with the shutting down of early voting hours, problems on election day in Georgia, Florida, and Arizona. Many of you heard about North Dakota and their requirement of imposing a street address requirement, a new street address requirement on their voter registration, which disenfranchised many Native Americans, specifically in Texas, that clearly targeted disenfranchisement of African-American college students. So all of these things, because there were in fact big close elections in many of these states and ongoing close elections in many of these states, anytime these steps toward voter suppression are taken, it potentially affects the result, affects again, whether our elections are truly democratic and fair, and of course, people's confidence in the outcome of those elections. One interesting development in terms of public attitudes, if you look at what Pew again found in this study, is that a majority of Americans now are very concerned about people being prevented from voting, and they're clearly more concerned about people being prevented from voting, even if they tried to vote, even though they tried to vote and they meet all requirements and are eligible, than they are about whether people are voting illegally. Of course, there is a right-wing narrative on this, that there are thousands of people trying to vote illegally. There is, of course, no factual basis, no demonstration there's ever been any serious amount of voter fraud of that kind in recent years. But these are competing narratives about what the problems are in our election. At the moment, the public is more attuned to what is actually the problem, which is that people are being prevented from voting. The examples I just showed you, 58% of Americans recognize that as a major problem. However, you still have a substantial minority, 41%, saying it's a major problem if someone's voting even though they're not eligible. So there are these two competing narratives. It's important to focus on the fact that people are being prevented from voting. Majority of Americans agree with that, but there is a partisan divide. And for instance, if we try to frame this as should it be easier or harder to vote, well, a majority of Americans think it should be, everything should be done to make it easier for citizens to vote. You have a partisan divide on that. Most Democrats agree with that. Republicans are divided. And the flip side also has some support saying that making it easier to vote would not make elections less secure. People saying, you have on the other side people saying that changing the rules to make it easier to vote would make elections less secure. That's kind of the right-wing narrative. You have a majority of Republicans agreeing with that. So you still have these partisan differences, even though, again, the bulk of Americans, the majority, including most Democrats and independents, believe that the bigger problem is that we're preventing people from voting. And then finally, of course, the major area in which people, and again, you'll hear some of this from Ellen and her organization about the very many successes on the ballot this year in terms of reforming and improving voting rights and reforming our election campaign systems. There is still this real crisis in our democracy in terms of the power and influence that money have and how that's drowning out sort of the equal voices of voters themselves. And voters understand this. Their perception is, in terms of what is causing dysfunction, there's wide agreement that we have a lot of dysfunction in our political system. What are the reasons for that? The number one reason that voters point to, this is from a Washington Post survey, is that 65% are saying that money in politics carries a lot of the blame, followed by wealthy political donors and people with extreme political views. But those are the three things people blame the most for dysfunction, led by money in politics. And of course, we found, and again, you'll hear more about this in a minute, many of the election results around the country, this came from in Citizens United, another group working for reform that we've done some work with. In addition to the direct actions that voters took to pass good ballot measures, there were many, many candidates now running on these issues. They weren't just running on healthcare and education and saying what they would do in terms of policy, but saying what they would do to improve democracy. 42 members of Congress new members of Congress saying they will be rejecting corporate PAC money. 30 of them new House members, 5 returning House members, 7 senators ran on that platform. I will not take corporate PAC money. Another 41 incoming new House members signing the letter calling for campaign finance reform to be the very first item. And in fact, Democratic caucus has said that will be the first item on their agenda in the House that they've now newly established the majority. 93 endorsed candidates reelected, campaign finance ballot measures, as we noted, and many of these endorsed House challenges. So people were running on this issue and winning, which again suggests kind of a convergence of attention and interest leading to potentially not only the direct changes in the state, but potential change at the national level as well. Where expansion of voting access was on the ballot, it passed easily. You'll see some more examples of that in a minute. I won't go through all of these, but every place essentially that voters have the chance to expand access and ability of people to vote, whether it's through early registration, election day registration, automatic registration, early voting, and other reforms. In most cases across the country, people voted yes to make those changes. And then I'll show you just two quick findings from a very recent poll. This is the first time these have been shown to anyone. This is from our Omnibus election survey, where we took a bunch of questions and asked voters as they were voting Sunday, Monday, Tuesday of last week on the eve of the election and on election day, what were some of their concerns and what was their focus when they were voting. And in the area of redistricting reform, which again is a way of, when gerrymandered districts are drawn, it is a way of diluting the voices of certain voters, entrenching people already in power, and making sure that people's votes and voices don't count equally. There were many ballot measures people voted on in several states to reform this system, to have fairly drawn districts. And we simply asked people, this is across the whole country now, do you favor or oppose reforming the process of redistricting to require nonpartisan rules so lines are drawn fairly with open meetings and transparency? 82% in favor, 74% strongly in favor. So this issue, which used to be kind of an esoteric concern of election nerds, has become quite visible and quite noticeable to voters, and they're very strongly now in favor of redistricting reform around the country. When they have the opportunity to support it, they did. And likewise, when we asked specifically about a particular version of reform, saying, what about a nonpartisan commission to draw the district lines? Those reforms passed in 3 states, and when we asked nationally, 75% are in favor of such reforms, an independent nonpartisan commission to draw the district lines. So really a powerful amount of momentum, a confluence of what we found in public attitudes, and some messaging that suggests that this has become much more visible and much more on the public agenda going forward from this election. So I'll stop there and turn it back over.
Great, David, thank you. That was a great overview. And we're going to be back. We'll hear from David again during the Q&A, but now let's turn to Ellen Moorehouse. And Ellen, as I noted, works with Represent Us, and she was on the ground in a number of states, as were her colleagues, and they really had quite a stellar record of accomplishment this election cycle. I'm really appreciative of your work. So Ellen, tell us about some of the findings based on work you've been doing in different states across the country, please.
Hello, yes, I'm so glad to be here, thank you. I was in North Dakota myself on election day, so it was a wonderful evening for turnout. David, I was really glad you mentioned what you did about voter suppression there in the state. It has been quite an obstacle to overcome. So hello, I am Ellen Moorehouse. Here at Represent Us, we are the nation's largest nonpartisan anti-corruption organization in the country. We've been working together across the states to figure out what it is we're going to do going forward. What do we have in front of us and what do we have? So I'm actually the daughter of a small business owner in Massachusetts, so I really appreciate the opportunity to connect with you all here today. So I want to set the groundwork of this discussion as a break from the hyperpartisanship we've come to expect during any political discussion, really. I know that anybody here tuning in really just cares about the future of this country and the tangible solutions we can offer. So this November alone, there were more than 24 political reform measures on the ballots. Cities and states across the country, so some municipal level, some statewide level initiatives, and that's quite frankly more than any other time in American history. There's anti-corruption momentum building in DC on both sides of the aisle, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But bipartisanship was a rare sight in the 2018 midterm elections. But ballot measures on the topic of government corruption really united unlikely allies from both sides of the aisle. And you'll see here, according to Gallup, Republicans and Democrats' unfavorable ratings of each other's party are near 90% on either side. But truly, that's not the whole story. And I'm actually really excited to tell you about some of the grassroots stories of the people behind the power movements leading the efforts on the ground. And specifically in Missouri, Republican State Senator Rob Schaaf, who's a member actually of the Represent Us Advisory Council, he worked closely with the Democratic treasurer there, Tashara Jones. They created a video entitled, "What a Democrat and a Republican Can Agree On." And the video highlighted one thing, the need for unity in cleaning up government. So really only by working together can we make government more transparent, limit the power of big money that David was talking about, and really hold legislators accountable to what the people want. So, and truly in my opinion, a well-functioning democracy is vital to our thriving economic system. So policies like ranked choice voting, gerrymandering reform, other crucial election protections that can fix that vital center where a majority of Americans actually are, according to what you just saw on David's slides. So what just happened in the midterms? I'm sure you've all watched election night coverage. You've had your inboxes just absolutely chock full of analytics. But I'm really here to focus on what you might not have read. So sort of the more optimistic story of the people behind this historic grassroots effect. And now that the dust has settled, one thing is really clear, that 15 out of 16 anti-corruption campaigns on election day really brought it home. And that brings our total to 24 out of 25 in 2018. So an absolutely extraordinary result in any advocacy field. And really, as the parties were going back and forth, anti-corruption parties showed that when given the chance, they overwhelmingly support accountability and fairness in the electoral system. It's actually a little exhilarating to a political wonk like me. It's like a brand new wave. It's not red or blue, but it's red, white, and blue, if you'll forgive the cheesiness of my excitement. So it really is a cross-partisan grassroots effort, fundamentally transforming government. And while the role that we played in each campaign varied from running the campaign soup to nuts, so to speak, in Alaska, North Dakota, South Dakota, we worked with partners on the grounds in various campaigns to further develop their digital and legal strategies. We worked with them to defend policies that they created. We did it all. So this week's victories are really a tribute to the thousands of incredible volunteers and coalition builders that came together, community organizations, skilled leaders across the country. So overall, 2018, extraordinary result. And I'm gonna rattle through a few of these and see some specific examples of the different states and what kinds of reforms happened on the ground. So we defended IRV, you'll see the use of some acronyms here, known as instant runoff voting. Very similar, used interchangeably with ranked choice voting, which was used for the first time in statewide elections in Maine. But in Memphis specifically, we actually supported the campaign on the ground there, Save IRV Memphis, with a no campaign. Memphians had supported IRV by 71% almost a decade ago. They voted on it, they passed it, but it had never been implemented. And now when it came down to the pike in 2019 to be implemented, city councilors put referenda on the ballot that says that they wanted to repeal it. So when it came time to act, we knew, they said it was just too complicated to understand something we all know isn't true. So we worked with the team there on the ground to defend instant runoff voting in Memphis. And we saw the first US House race in history that will be decided by ranked choice voting in Maine, actually, which is already facing its first lawsuit, as the US Representative Bruce Poliquin is actually suing to stop. He first had a large portion of the votes, then he fell behind, and unfortunately, in the way that ranked choice vote ballots are tabulated, he's actually now bringing legal action against it to stop the impact of ranked choice voting. So we can't emphasize enough the importance of dealing with and defending these crucial policies in Maine, in Memphis, and developing them in cities and states across the United States. So these types of reforms, in our opinion, really foster moderation and civility. When politicians are vying for your second and third choice vote, they're not likely to trash their opponent or do any other political unsavory things that we think of as really typical of this gridlock. And as David mentioned, we saw so much gerrymandering reform this election, a really hot topic last Tuesday. There were game-changing proposals to end partisan gerrymandering approved in 3 states, Michigan, Missouri, and Colorado, with the results of a fourth, Utah, pending. Utah is still on track to win, but the vote count is still underway. It's not quite official yet. It's at 50.3%. We view it as a likely win. But it's been an absolutely incredible grassroots story. If you haven't heard of Katie Fahey, Voters Not Politicians in Michigan, you should definitely check her out. They work together across the state, county by county, with 425,000 signatures submitted. And it all started because of a Facebook post. She asked if anybody wanted to help her tackle gerrymandering, and a movement was born. So true grassroots power out of Michigan. We saw some security and access to the ballot. One of America's most famous towns, Fargo, North Dakota, made history with a brand new type of voting method, approval voting. Campaign of finance disclosures were David and Goliath battles across literally the country. And in North Dakota, especially, which David touched on, which was where I was for election day. One of the most impressive grassroots campaigns I've had the privilege to work with. There was 4 self-described badass grandmas who came together with an incredible coalition to support Measure 1, statewide anti-corruption legislation. So Dina Butcher, who is a Republican, and Ellen Chaffee, who's a Democrat, they joined forces to form this group together, literally putting country over party and leading the anti-corruption movement in North Dakota. It won with nearly 54% support, and it puts tough new ethics laws in place, new dark money disclosure requirements, and campaign finance reform. We also saw automatic voter registration pass in Nevada and Michigan, and ethics reform. As I mentioned, North Dakota was one of 7 states without an ethics commission, and Measure 1 will change that. But unfortunately, it wasn't all roses, and we still have a lot of work to do. Our one loss was in South Dakota, where the people had campaigned for a final say over anti-corruption legislation that they had passed in 2016, known as IM 22. There, the legislature entered an emergency state of repeal where they brazenly repealed the reform. And again, the people brought the measure in 2018, where lobbying groups spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on a campaign to misinform voters and ultimately prevailed. So Represent South Dakota volunteers there are getting reorganized and preparing for the next round of the fight. So we know we have a lot more in front of us with regards to not only implementing these reforms, but also protecting them when it comes time to it. So in keeping it going, we mentioned all these nonpartisan redistricting proposals that were on the ballot, Colorado and Michigan, Missouri and Utah. Though each proposal differs to varying degrees, some impact congressional oversight, some impact just state legislative districts, the same feel behind them was to implement a redistricting system that puts the needs of the voters ahead of sort of political party scheming. So the challenge in getting these proposals passed also varied from state to state. Some had zero registered opposition, while others had to survive court challenges and opposition from really heavily moneyed opponents, who included both Democrats and Republicans, depending on who was in control at the time, quite frankly, and including lobbying groups that benefited from their systems. So we see what happened when businesses oppose change. In Michigan, one of the state's most powerful lobbying groups, the Michigan Chamber of Commerce, backed an unsuccessful lawsuit that attempted to remove anti-gerrymandering from the ballot. Represent Michigan, a local chapter of Represent Us, and they ran an accountability campaign that targeted the chamber board members with ads, petitions, and protests, whatever we could do to get the word out about the lawsuit of trying to take away the people's right to vote. And in Missouri, the Chamber of Commerce was also involved in litigation to stop the people from voting. But ultimately, the Clean Missouri Act passed by 67%. So the people's will was pretty clear there. And we've seen what happened when businesses support change. The Chamber in Colorado, where redistricting passed with 71% of the vote. And earlier this year in 2018 in Ohio, was essential to passing with 75% of the vote. So of course, in order for these reforms to have their intended effect, we need to understand and remain engaged in this system. So that might sound like an impressive list of wins for the anti-corruption movement, and believe me, make no mistake about it, it certainly is. But we have a lot of work ahead of us to advance public policy and technology solutions that improve our government from end to end. So how we run our elections, how laws are made, and then how those laws are subsequently implemented. It all matters. And radical extremism on all sides of the aisle, it leaves no room for compromise on literally the most important and the most paralyzing issues that affect employers and employees across America. So I'd argue that moderation leads to greater stability and certainty. When there's less political volatility, it's easier for businesses to make and execute their long-term plans without risk of the business climate shifting overnight. And the extent to which that's borne out is certainly up for debate, but that's the thinking anyways. And so to make this lasting impact, Represent Us is focused on the very structure, changing the very structure of our rigged elections. There's a big spotlight here, really our overall theme in this election season. We've talked about ranked choice voting, followed very closely by redistricting reform, followed even closer by access and protection to elections. But there's a real method to this madness. So since May of this year, there have been 5 anti-gerrymandering victories, starting with Ohio in May. I said which passed with over 75% of the vote. But these numbers you see here next to the states are actually the congressional representation. So Ohio has 16 US House districts, Michigan has 14, Colorado has 7, Utah has 4. So these seats will have a lasting legacy in our Congress, and we hope they're filled with fairly elected public representation to ultimately underscore the bottom line, that moderation is good for business. So sort of talking about where we've been that led us up to this historic election day, over the course of the year, excluding election day, 8 states combined with a population of approximately 50 million people passed similar laws and referendums. And now I won't walk you through this list, but history has proved that state by state, a grassroots strategy works time and time again to bring about slow but steady reform to the institutions that matter the most. So the strategy of winning state laws to build towards federal reform has worked in the past. We've seen it with giving women the right to vote, which passed state by state until ultimately passing federally. 34 states legalized interracial marriage before it ultimately became federal law. And the list goes on, but the takeaway is very clear that the passing of state laws is sort of a catalyst to winning that sweeping federal election reform on these fundamental issues. So again, fast forwarding to this election day, I won't read these all, but these historic wins, I know it's a lot of text on a screen, but just know that the results are very clear. And I'm really glad David touched on it, because the midterm elections were a call to action from the American people. It was literally a congressional mandate for Congress to act. Reformers really hope that this string of state and city wins will provide the midterms directions for congressional action. And quite frankly, we find that it's more about power than party when it comes to who opposes the anti-corruption reform that we're proposing. And that corruption doesn't really wear a party label. It's just it comes down to who's holding the reins. So these are some of the cities and states with historic wins in 2008. And I've included a link here on the bottom to our election hub, which I hope you check out. If you want to find out any more about any of these campaigns, cities or state, our hub is just a nonpartisan source of unbiased factual information. I can't recommend it enough. So what comes next? We've had an incredibly banner year, both with wins and some setbacks that reminds us our work is not yet done. The historic midterm elections drew record-breaking turnout in many states as game-changing elections literally swept. So after all this information, polls, and analytics, where do we go? Republican U.S. Senator Ben Sasse has already filed several bills to, quote, drain the swamp. And Democratic U.S. Senator Elizabeth Warren has also filed an anti-corruption bill. Democrats did win the House chamber, and they've discussed advancing U.S. Rep. John Sarbanes' campaign finance reform proposal as their first bill of the next Congress. So the conversation is already clearly happening out there. It's just a matter of seeing if they want to live up to what they've done. President Trump is readying for re-election, and 2020 is coming fast down the pike. So we know things along the lines of drain the swamp will come fast down the heels as he's trying to show progress to his party as well. And as for state campaigns, we see a great opportunity for a big play on ranked choice voting as a key elections reform. With such great success this year, work will continue on promoting and, of course, protecting anti-gerrymandering efforts and reforms. Work will continue on automatic voter registration and other reforms that improve access to the ballot, like vote by mail, for instance. And most importantly, just to underscore it all, this week, our theory of change was affirmed, that voters can take control. Voters can go around politicians that aren't acting in their best interests, and they can pass these strong anti-corruption reforms in their cities and states that build an ultimate drumbeat towards federal reform. And as we sort of begin this next chapter of the epic battle of the next 2 years that are about to begin, and the 4 after that, the cycle never ends. So it's about our movement expanding and scaling to the capacity commensurate with the challenge at hand. So formulating our opinions around the most impactful policies and the smartest political strategies. And that's what we're here for. The power of the grassroots, stronger than ever. So the people are coming together, putting country over party to fight corruption nationwide. And Represent Us will be here every step of the way. That's all I've got for you folks.
Ellen, thank you. That was very inspiring, and I really appreciate the optimistic view and the direction that you've offered. So we look forward to working with Represent Us in the coming weeks and months.
Thank you.
I think it was really notable that you cited that these precedents at the state level do augur well for federal action. So Sarah, let me turn it over to you now and tell us a bit about Business for America's work on these issues.
All right, thank you, Richard. And thank you, Ellen and Represent Us, for joining us, and David and Lake Research Partners for helping to put all this together. I wanted to actually start by underscoring something that Ellen just said. You know, a lot of times when I talk to people about the fact that I've gotten involved in political reform and believing in the idea of representative democracy and that government can work better for everyone, they almost invariably say, that's great, that's fantastic, I'm so glad you're doing that, but I don't think it can be fixed. And I think if there's anything that you come away from these midterm elections with is the understanding that not only is it possible to solve this problem, but we already have the solutions. We just need to get them into place. And we're starting to do that. Now, part of the trick is that not every state has a citizen-led ballot initiative process. So many of the wins that you just saw came because grassroots, along with business and other parts of the voting community, came together to say, we want change, and they can go around their state legislatures. That's 23 out of the 50 states, I believe, have, if I recall correctly, have a citizen-led ballot initiative process. So that means it's going to be a little trickier than some of those other states. But as Ellen alluded to, as we start to create this pressure and this momentum, it's going to be harder for them to say no. And that's really why Business for America came to be. I spent the first 20 years of my professional career in the private sector, was in the world of business and technology and design and leadership, and really enjoyed it. And some years ago, while I was still at Apple, decided that I wanted to get involved in helping to make the world a better place. And I was going to do that as my hobby, and did a lot of pro bono consulting and volunteer work for a number of different organizations, including Represent Us, along with a number of others, making this argument that government needs to work better, and that really it's a rising tide lifts all boats kind of scenario. When our government is well functioning, it's good for everybody in the country. So as I was doing this volunteer work and was working at Apple, and I'm in the private sector, and I was wondering where was the business voice? Who was making the economic arguments for why we need to solve these problems? A lot of times the way you hear it in the media, and even from some of the organizations working on this issue, corporations are the enemy. And I don't believe that's really true. I think if you look at it, for the most part, business people don't wake up in the morning trying to figure out how to destroy democracy, right? They're citizens just like you and me. And most of us want the government to work well. So how do we create a platform for people in the business community to stand up and say we need to solve these problems, because these are solvable problems? So let me share my screen here. So yeah, I wanted to tell you a little bit about Business for America. So why does business care? We need to make that argument. We need to prove to Americans that the interests of the business community are really aligned with the interests of the general public in having well-functioning government. And having a well-functioning government requires a well-functioning democracy. So first of all, of course, there is the level of your own business and the policies that affect you directly, like healthcare, taxes and wages, regulations, and those affect your bottom line. So that's sort of the self-interest of having a better functioning government. But of course, when you look more broadly at the entire business sector, more of a macro argument, and the overall economy, you can see that there's a compelling argument to be made here. There's so many problems that aren't getting solved across the country and that are having a negative impact on the economy and suppressing the business community. In fact, the Harvard Business School in 2016 and 2017 found that dysfunctional government is the #1 issue harming America's economic competitiveness. But beyond that, beyond the individual business argument and the macroeconomic argument, there's really the argument that this affects every American. And if you're in the business world, this means your employees, your customers, your neighbors, your stakeholders, everybody. This matters to everybody. And so there's an enlightened self-interest in getting involved with this, because you want all of your customers to be doing well on the basis of a healthy economy. You know, everybody has the support that they need, then you care about this issue, this root issue of how our government functions. So Business for America was created to catalyze the business community to advocate for the public policies and technologies that are going to strengthen representative democracy, ensure election integrity, and modernize government. We're not just a think tank. We really are here to try to take action and advance these policies. We're here to educate the business community and beyond on why this matters, and then reach out to lawmakers and other elected leaders to say these problems need to get solved. And in fact, we're at the stage where a lot of these solutions have been in place for a while, and we can show that they work and work well. So a number of the solutions that we'll be advancing include election integrity, security and audits. That's where our focus is right now. But we also want to broaden election access and participation. We're focused on election competitiveness. The things that we talked about earlier, gerrymandering, open primaries, and ranked choice voting do make elections more competitive, but they also reduce the partisanship. They make elections less toxic. That in itself is a value for our society. We need to deal with the issue of money in politics. Clearly, there's a corrosive effect there, and we need our leaders to be able to do what makes sense for the community at large and not just for their donors. And we need to broaden ethics and accountability, including making sure that those laws are enforced. And lastly, modern technology is a part of this, not just how government is run on a day-to-day basis, but technology could actually be used to increase ethics and accountability and deal with, you know, elections and provide better service to all our citizens, and we can do that at a lower cost. So technology is something we haven't even begun to really achieve everything we can there. So that's our model of change. We're going to mobilize business leaders to take action. We're going to be partnering with other groups. We're not going to fly solo on this. There's a lot of people already working on this and a lot of opportunities for business to add its voice, sort of put a little more weight on the scales there to tip the scales for reform. And especially as these fights get a little trickier and you know, states that may not have as much of a organizing basis, that we can make a big difference. We'll be working at the federal, state, and local level. And lastly, we want to help advance these ideas around the business and economic arguments that are really compelling and make a big difference to lawmakers. One thing that comes up, you know, when we're talking about reform and we're reading the news, I want you to keep your ears open for this, because it happens a lot. These issues get framed in this either or way. We heard it earlier where people are thinking, you know, we either have access to the polls, we either have fair access to the elections, or we have security. And what I like to say there is it's 2018. This is a solvable problem. We can have both. We can have elections where we know that they're secure, or at least as secure as possible, certainly way more secure than they are today. And we can know that they are accurate with a very high degree of confidence with audits and better technology and better processes. We shouldn't have ballots that we're not exactly sure they were handled right. It should be very clear that everything got done in the right way, so we can reestablish trust. And at the same time, we can make sure that voters and everybody who has the right to vote has easier access to that right. There's no reason why these two things can't be true. And I think that the business community has a unique role to play in looking past those partisan stories and focusing on solutions and helping to get those through. So I want to think too, like just another frame on this. You know, sometimes people say, well, this isn't really the issue and this isn't really the issue. Sometimes it doesn't even matter how big the problem is. Once it catches the public's imagination, sometimes it may grow out of scope of what the real issue is. But think about this: the real problem here isn't necessarily that, you know, little thing happened over here, a little thing happened over here. A bigger problem is trust. Americans don't trust our elections. They don't trust who's in office, and the whole thing gets sullied, right? It reduces participation in our elections, and it really harms the fabric of our society. And it makes it harder for the lawmakers that are operating in good faith to govern. So we need to deal with some of these distractions by solving these problems, again, with proven solutions that we know exist today. So that is a little on the role of Business for America and why we think there's a compelling business argument to be made here. And so the last piece I want to just circle back here is, you know, what is going to happen in 2019? We're going to have, you know, a US Congress that's pretty different, and change can be a good thing. We know that this arguments about our government dysfunction, the partisanship, you know, the lack of trust, the concern about corruption, the concerns about money in politics, that those appeal to both the left and right. So this doesn't have to be a us versus them situation. What we need to do is find ways to bring people together and find ways to tell the stories and position the solutions so we can get everybody on board with making those things happen. Federal government's going to be tricky for a while, right? We have now, you know, Congress and the Senate are different, going to be led by different parties. So it's a little unclear exactly what next year is going to look like, but there will be opportunities. We're certainly going to see bills being introduced. Some of the ones Ellen already mentioned, there's going to be a lot more on the slate. So we're going to be keeping our eyes open for where we can engage there, but we also want to engage at the state level. there's been a shift in a number of states in terms of more reform-oriented leaders being elected, and that's true left and right. So, so we'll be keeping our eyes peeled and finding the opportunities for us to organize the business community around making those changes happen. I'm going to stop there because I wanted to be sure we had time for a couple of questions, and I'm going to hand it back to Richard.
Okay, great, good. Sarah, thank you. Alan, and so, you know, one of the things you were talking about corruption. And so you were using the term anti-corruption, and I wonder if you could just clarify from Represent Us's perspective, is that the same as political reform or democracy reform? Are you including the same range of issues?
I am. Honestly, in my opinion, we consider it really to be a holistic suite of policies that, if enacted, yes, can begin to address the influence of money in politics, special moneyed interests that control the conversation and narrative. So electoral reforms like ranked choice voting, like increasing voter access to the ballot, vote by mail, automatic voter registration. All of these things are small pieces to the puzzle that ultimately contribute to an overall picture of fighting reform.
Mm-hmm. Okay, okay, great, great. David, let me ask you to pick up on that. And, you know, when you were polling, when you were doing your polling work and also with Pew's results, did you find that corruption sort of resonates with voters, or do they have a somewhat different orientation?
It's certainly a description that resonates with voters. They agree that what's going on, the way our system is working has, you know, it's a word that comes up, right, organically when voters are just trying to describe what's wrong with the system we have. And in fact, you could see, you know, some of the energy around that, frankly, being captured, you know, 2 years ago when Trump ran and said he was going to drain the swamp. There was, you know, that was addressing a fundamental feeling that's, you know, widely shared across the political spectrum, that system is being run by a few powerful interests, that the voices of the people are not being heard, they're not being respected or listened to, and, you know, that there are systematic, you know, problem, you know, the structural issues that are making that, you know, making it less democratic, making it harder for people to participate and have their voices heard within the system. So that urgency is felt across the board, and corruption is certainly one of the words people use for it. When we are talking about messaging and communicating about these issues, we often say to advocates, you know, you don't just want to talk about corruption, because people also think of corruption as something that is, it involves a quid pro quo, and if you can't demonstrate somebody took money and did something as a result of that, then maybe that isn't really corruption, and you get into lots of legalistic sort of frames of mind. Whereas if you talk about the need for everyone to be able to participate, have a voice in their own in their democracy, and that when we pass reforms that give people a voice, that give people an equal voice, allow them to be heard, and Represent Us is good about doing this in their advocacy, that creates a sense of possibility. So it's not just, here's a bad thing, here are all the bad people doing it, we need to stop them, but here's something we can do to change the rules so that we can be heard and participate. And that we are the people themselves, of course, become the agents of change. And that's a much more empowering message, makes people feel more positive about the possibility that things can be better, because that's the other big enemy of sort of actually accomplishing these changes, in addition to the sort of structural resistance of those who are already in power, is the belief that people have, it's never really going to change, it's not going to get better. We can see in the election results this year, the ground shifting on that, people believing that these things can be changed, believing the possibility of these reforms, and we want to engage in communication and advocacy that connects to that and doesn't make people cynical about the possibility of making the system work better.
And let me ask you, Sarah, when you have been talking to business leaders across the country, are you finding there's increasing interest to engage, you know, in part based on what David and Ellen have just stated about the impact that these voices can have in the process?
Absolutely. It's kind of the thing, business leaders are business leaders, but they're also parts of the community. So they're paying attention and listening to, all this stuff that we've been hearing in the news and listening with great interest. I think one of the points that Ellen raised earlier too, that's so important is that above many things, people in the business sector value predictability. And just having a system that's going to be a little bit more stable and sensible, and having practical approaches and bipartisan collaboration on getting things done, it's going to make a huge difference. But of course, political reform is going to happen first for us to get to a scenario where that's really the case. I think the other thing too that's really great about working with the business community on this is that business leaders, for the most part, are systems thinkers, right? They are looking at the big picture and the long term a lot of times. Sure, they are also focused on quarterly results and, or meeting their payroll month by month, depending on the business. But these kinds of pragmatic approaches and systems thinking that's involved with advancing political reform, I think makes the business community a real natural partner on this stuff.
Okay, great. Good. Well, I don't see any other questions. So, and it's about at the half hour. So let me just remind those of you watching and listening that all three organizations are happy to talk to you further. Your involvement in the coming months is really critical. As all three speakers indicated, there is a lot of momentum on the ground, both at the local, the state and federal level. And that I can just, tell you from my own direct experience on advocating at the state and federal level, it really makes a difference when business leaders and advocates show up and express their views. And you can do that, in a nonpartisan way. So we encourage you to get involved. These will continue at Business for America to hold webinars, and encourage you to seek us out if you have any questions or comments. And if there are no further thoughts from our panelists, I'll give you all an opportunity to a last word. Ellen, anything you want to leave us with?
I think it's an incredible movement happening across the country right now. I've seen some questions here about research or suggested messaging, about framing some of these issues. And quite frankly, Richard, what you just said, I think is the most important part. Be yourself. Speak about what matters to you. And if these are issues that you're facing in your business, in your community, then chances are a majority of Americans are feeling the same thing. Mm-hmm. So how we speak to each other matters. These policies that can affect our polarization really matter. So I really think it's just about you getting involved with what matters most to you.
Right. Thank you. David.
Yeah, I'll just add, it's an exciting moment to be, we've been doing research on these issues. I've been doing research on these issues for about 20 years, and to see it sort of come together there really is a sense of movement and possibility that we haven't seen in a long time. And it's exciting. We see that in our own data in researching the attitudes of voters. And of course, we see it on the ground in terms of the actual results and accomplishments that groups like Ellen's and Business for America are achieving. So that's, we're thrilled to be a part of it. We're going to keep investigating and trying to understand the best ways to move forward, the most effective ways to move forward, and we hope to be of assistance to all of you in doing that.
Good, thank you. And Sarah, anything you want to add?
Just thanks again to everybody, both our panelists, David, Ellen, Richard, thank you for moderating, and thanks to all the attendees, everybody who came to listen in. It really is a special moment in American history. Things are happening. And for those who are in the business community, or if you have friends in the business community, their voices matter. Business has an outsized voice here, and it's really incumbent on us to speak up. It's time to stand up for what's right. And if we want representative democracy to work, what's the alternative? I think if we don't figure out how to make representative democracy really work, it's not really a good scenario. So let's do this. I'm can be reached at bonk@bfa.us. We are organizing business leaders to work on secure elections right now, but in 2019, we hope to get involved with other initiatives too. So please reach out anytime.